On February 12, 2026, the administration formally moved to revoke the Environmental Protection Agency's 2009 endangerment finding, the legal determination that greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health and welfare under the Clean Air Act. At first glance, it appeared technical. There were no market crashes that morning. Gas prices did not spike overnight. Most households likely did not notice the announcement at all. But the endangerment finding is not just another regulation. It has served as the legal foundation for more than a decade of federal climate rules, including vehicle emission standards and power sector limits. Removing that foundation does not immediately erase every rule. Instead, it begins a process. States are expected to challenge the decision. Courts may issue injunctions. Appeals could stretch across election cycles. What looks like a narrow administrative action may evolve into a multi-year legal and economic recalibration. The key issue is not whether regulation becomes stricter or looser. It is whether the rules governing long-term investment remain durable or become legally unsettled. Many observers interpret this move through a political lens as either deregulation or environmental retrenchment, but markets do not primarily react to ideology. They react to predictability. The 2009 endangerment finding has functioned as a structural anchor. Corporations, utilities, automakers, insurers, and state governments built compliance systems and capital plans around the assumption that federal climate regulation had a stable legal base. If that base is withdrawn and then contested in court, policy direction becomes tied to litigation timelines rather than legislative clarity. That distinction matters. Businesses can adapt to stricter rules. They can adapt to looser rules. What complicates planning is oscillation, when the durability of rules becomes uncertain. In that environment, executives may delay long-term projects. States may reinforce their own regulatory frameworks. Financial institutions may apply internal climate risk standards regardless of federal shifts. The story is therefore less about emissions levels in 2026. It is about whether the legal ground beneath a major regulatory system becomes contested territory for years. When foundational rules become questions, economic actors adjust cautiously, even if no immediate shock is visible. To understand the systemic implications, it helps to zoom out. The endangerment finding is not simply a policy preference. It is the legal predicate that enables greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act. Its revocation does not automatically dismantle existing rules, but it introduces legal ambiguity into the regulatory architecture. That ambiguity can influence several interconnected systems. First, capital allocation. Energy infrastructure, manufacturing plants, vehicle platforms, and grid upgrades are designed with investment horizons measured in decades. When regulatory durability is uncertain, companies may build flexibility into projects or postpone final investment decisions. Flexibility increases costs. Delays reduce momentum. Second, federalism. States such as California maintain their own emissions standards. If federal oversight weakens, some states may tighten their frameworks. The result could be a patchwork of standards across jurisdictions. For nationwide companies, compliance complexity may increase even if federal regulation declines. Third, trade alignment. The European Union has implemented carbon border adjustment mechanisms that price carbon intensity in imported goods. If U.S. regulatory direction diverges significantly from European frameworks, exporters may face compliance recalibration. Firms could continue meeting stricter standards to preserve market access, regardless of federal shifts. Fourth, financial markets. Banks and institutional investors increasingly evaluate climate-related exposure. If federal policy becomes legally contested, capital markets may rely more heavily on internal risk models rather than regulatory guidance. In that case, private standards could partially substitute for federal ones. None of these adjustments imply economic contraction. They imply recalibration. The systemic question is whether this recalibration is temporary, resolved through courts and clarified within a short horizon, or whether climate governance enters a prolonged cycle of legal contestation. If the latter occurs, regulatory stability may become more difficult to assume. And in complex economies, stability is often less about the direction of policy and more about its perceived durability. To understand the deeper implications of revoking the EPA's endangerment finding, it helps to step beneath the headlines and examine the systems that quietly depend on regulatory durability. At the surface level, this is a legal determination under the Clean Air Act. Beneath that surface, however, sits a network of economic expectations, institutional constraints, and capital flows that evolved over more than a decade. The first invisible layer is long-horizon investment planning. Energy infrastructure, automotive platforms, grid modernization, industrial retrofits, and insurance models are built on forecasts that extend 10 to 30 years. These forecasts incorporate assumptions about regulation, not because companies prefer one outcome over another, but because they need to calculate risk. If a legal foundation becomes contested and subject to litigation, the timeline of regulatory clarity becomes uncertain. Courts move according to their own procedural rhythms. Injunctions may temporarily suspend rules. Appeals may reverse or reinstate them. During that period, companies are forced to evaluate multiple scenarios simultaneously. That does not freeze the economy, but it can shift behavior from decisive to conditional. Conditional planning often means smaller initial commitments, phased projects, or modular designs that can adapt to changing rules. These design choices are rational responses to uncertainty. They are also typically more expensive than building under stable expectations. The second invisible layer is federal-state interaction. Environmental regulation in the United States has long involved shared authority. Some states set stricter standards than the federal baseline. Others align more closely with federal policy. If the federal foundation weakens or becomes legally contested, state governments may move to fill the gap. This can produce divergence. For a company operating nationwide, divergence introduces complexity. Instead of complying with one federal rule, firms may need to navigate multiple state frameworks. Large corporations can absorb that complexity more easily than small firms. Compliance departments expand. Legal advisory budgets grow. The effect is not dramatic. It is administrative. Over time, administrative complexity influences market structure. Larger firms with resources to manage fragmentation may gain relative advantage. The third invisible layer is trade alignment. Climate regulation increasingly intersects with international trade. The European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, links carbon intensity to market access in certain sectors. If U.S. regulatory standards diverge or become unstable, exporters may continue meeting higher standards regardless of domestic policy shifts, simply to maintain access to foreign markets. In this case, global markets can partially override domestic deregulation. At the same time, prolonged uncertainty could complicate transatlantic climate coordination. Allies may seek greater policy independence or diversify supply chains to reduce exposure to U.S. legal variability. That does not imply confrontation. It reflects hedging behavior in interconnected systems. The fourth invisible layer involves financial markets. Over the past decade, institutional investors have incorporated climate-related risk into asset pricing models. Insurance companies assess physical risk exposure. Banks evaluate carbon-intensive assets against long-term transition scenarios. These internal frameworks operate independently of federal rulemaking, but they are influenced by regulatory signals. If the legal basis for federal regulation becomes uncertain, markets may increase reliance on private risk standards. In effect, financial actors can act as parallel stabilizers. However, if legal volatility persists, risk premiums may adjust. Investors do not necessarily withdraw capital. They may simply demand higher returns for exposure to regulatory uncertainty. That adjustment is often subtle but cumulative. The fifth invisible layer is political time. Climate policy now intersects with electoral cycles. If litigation extends beyond one election cycle, future administrations could attempt to reverse course again. Businesses planning long-term projects must therefore consider not only the current rule, but the probability of future reversals. This introduces a feedback loop. The more policy appears reversible, the more actors treat it as provisional. Provisional policy encourages cautious capital deployment. Cautious capital deployment can slow visible economic momentum. Slower momentum can intensify political debate about policy direction. That debate, in turn, increases perceived instability. Importantly, none of these mechanisms require dramatic events. They operate gradually. The rollback of the endangerment finding does not automatically dismantle clean energy investment. It does not guarantee expansion of fossil fuel production. It does not predetermine trade conflict. What it does is introduce legal ambiguity into a foundational rule. In complex systems, foundational rules matter less for their immediate effects and more for their signaling value. When a foundational rule is contested, the entire structure must adjust around the uncertainty. Adjustment can be stabilizing. Courts may clarify authority quickly. Agencies may issue replacement guidance. Markets may adapt smoothly. But if ambiguity persists, the system becomes more layered and more cautious. The invisible structure, therefore, is not about emissions levels alone. It is about how economies respond when legal durability becomes uncertain. In that environment, actors continue operating, projects continue advancing, trade continues flowing. Yet beneath the visible activity, planning assumptions shift. And when assumptions shift, trajectories can change, not abruptly, but incrementally, over years rather than days. Escalation in this case is unlikely to look dramatic. It would not begin with a sudden spike in prices or an immediate restructuring of the energy sector. It would begin in courtrooms, in administrative filings, and in conference rooms where executives ask a different kind of question. Not what the rule is today, but how long it might last. In the first 6 months, the dominant movement would likely be procedural rather than economic. States would file lawsuits. Advocacy groups would challenge the revocation. Federal courts might issue temporary injunctions while reviewing whether the rollback meets statutory standards. Appeals would be scheduled. Legal arguments would unfold in parallel across jurisdictions. During that period, most economic activity would continue as before. Utilities would not dismantle power plants overnight. Automakers would not redesign entire production platforms. Investors would not abandon markets in response to a single administrative action. The surface of the economy would appear stable. Yet beneath that surface, planning assumptions would begin to shift. Corporate boards would review capital expenditure timelines with greater caution. Energy producers would weigh whether to expand output aggressively or wait for judicial clarity. Manufacturers would model alternative regulatory outcomes into long-term forecasts. The adjustment would not be visible in headline data, but it would influence decision speed. Projects might proceed more gradually. Commitments might be staged rather than finalized. If courts move quickly and deliver clear guidance, this initial phase could stabilize. But if injunctions are issued, lifted, and then reinstated across different circuits, the legal timeline itself could become the central variable. Policy would no longer be anchored to legislative durability. It would be anchored to litigation calendars. As the issue moves into the 6 to 18-month range, the effects would likely broaden. States that support stronger emission standards might reinforce their own regulatory frameworks. Others might align more closely with the federal rollback. Companies operating across state lines would face a landscape that is not uniform but layered. Layered compliance introduces administrative friction. It requires more legal review, more documentation, more coordination across subsidiaries. Large firms with global footprints and extensive compliance departments could absorb that complexity. Smaller firms might find it more burdensome. The cost would not necessarily appear as a tax increase. It would show up as expanded overhead and longer planning cycles. At the same time, capital markets could begin incorporating durability risk into pricing. Investors typically respond not only to whether regulation is strict or relaxed, but to whether it appears stable. If climate governance begins to look contingent on court rulings and election cycles, some investors may demand higher returns to compensate for policy variability. That does not imply capital withdrawal. It implies repricing. Internationally, trade alignment could become more sensitive. The European Union's carbon border mechanisms link emission standards to market access. If U.S. regulatory direction diverges or remains uncertain, exporters might choose to comply with stricter standards regardless of domestic posture to preserve international competitiveness. In that scenario, federal rollback does not fully determine corporate behavior. Global market access does. If ambiguity continues into the 18 to 36-month horizon, the issue may become structural rather than transitional. By that stage, either courts will have clarified the legal authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, or litigation will have produced narrow rulings that leave substantial room for future reinterpretation. In a stabilization pathway, clarity would return. Agencies would adjust to the judicial interpretation. States would recalibrate. Markets would regain confidence that regulatory direction, even if changed, rests on a durable foundation. Under that outcome, the period of ambiguity would function as a recalibration rather than a lasting shift. In an escalation pathway, however, climate governance could become tied more closely to electoral turnover and judicial sequencing. If successive administrations signal opposing intentions and courts remain central arbiters, firms may begin treating federal climate rules as provisional rather than permanent. Planning would adapt accordingly. Projects might be designed with built-in flexibility to accommodate future reversals. Financial institutions might lean more heavily on internal climate risk standards rather than federal signals. This type of escalation does not resemble confrontation. It resembles institutional thickening. Rules would not disappear. They would become layered, contested, and conditional. Over time, that condition could influence competitiveness. Jurisdictions offering clearer long-term frameworks, regardless of strictness, may attract investment seeking stability. The beneficiaries in a prolonged ambiguity environment would likely be actors capable of navigating complexity. Multinational firms, diversified energy producers, and large financial institutions could adapt more easily than smaller, regionally concentrated enterprises. The costs would be dispersed rather than concentrated. Consumers might experience incremental adjustments through pricing. Local governments might face administrative strain. Acceleration of escalation could occur if appellate courts issue conflicting rulings, if trade partners formally link market access to regulatory alignment, or if political cycles introduce additional volatility. De-escalation could occur if judicial clarification arrives sooner than expected, or if legislative consensus reduces reliance on administrative reinterpretation. The central pattern is cumulative rather than explosive. Escalation here does not depend on dramatic events. It depends on whether uncertainty becomes embedded in expectations. If economic actors come to believe that foundational regulatory rules are frequently contestable, they adjust behavior accordingly. And in complex systems, behavior shaped by caution can alter trajectories gradually, not through crisis, but through incremental recalibration over years rather than days. For most households, this issue will not arrive as a headline shock. It is unlikely to produce an overnight spike in fuel prices or an immediate wave of layoffs. Its effects, if they materialize, would more likely appear through slower, quieter channels. For middle-class families, the most visible exposure is energy and transportation costs. If regulatory direction becomes uncertain and energy producers hesitate to commit to long-term infrastructure, supply decisions may become more cautious. That caution can influence pricing over time. The changes would likely be incremental rather than dramatic, but even modest increases in electricity or fuel costs can compound across a household budget. Job stability could vary by region. Areas tied closely to fossil fuel production might experience short-term stability if compliance pressures ease. Regions focused on renewable energy manufacturing or electric vehicle supply chains could see investment timing shift depending on how durable federal policy appears. The key factor is not strictness, but predictability. Employers hire most confidently when they believe the rules will remain stable long enough to justify long-term commitments. For retirees, the issue is less about employment and more about stability. Retirement portfolios often include exposure to utilities, energy producers, and industrial firms. If regulatory ambiguity increases market volatility in those sectors, retirees may experience uneven returns. Diversification helps, but uncertainty requires closer monitoring. Small businesses may face the most practical pressure. Energy costs and compliance complexity affect operating margins directly. Larger corporations can distribute regulatory adaptation costs across scale. Smaller firms often absorb them directly. If fragmentation between federal and state standards increases, administrative burden may rise modestly for businesses operating across jurisdictions. For younger workers, the longer-term question concerns opportunity. Clean energy infrastructure, grid modernization, and advanced manufacturing depend on long-horizon policy signals. If capital becomes more cautious due to legal uncertainty, growth in emerging sectors may proceed more gradually. Opportunity does not disappear, but its pace can shift. Across all groups, the common thread is not crisis. It is durability. When foundational rules appear contested, economic actors move carefully. Carefulness reduces volatility in the short term. Over time, it can also reduce momentum. There is no immediate cliff in this story, no sudden rupture. The legal rollback of a regulatory foundation does not automatically dismantle an industry. Courts may clarify authority swiftly. Agencies may adapt within existing frameworks. Markets may absorb the shift smoothly. But the deeper question lingers. When a foundational rule becomes legally unsettled, does stability return quickly, or does uncertainty become embedded? If regulatory direction begins to hinge on litigation calendars and electoral cycles, economic actors may gradually treat federal policy as provisional. Planning becomes conditional. Investment becomes staged. Alignment between states and federal authority becomes layered rather than unified. None of these developments guarantee disruption. They suggest the possibility of a more complex operating environment. In that environment, businesses adapt, households adjust, and markets recalibrate. The economy continues functioning. Yet the baseline assumption that major regulatory pillars rest on durable legal ground may feel less automatic. Whether this episode becomes a temporary recalibration or the beginning of a longer cycle depends on institutions working through the uncertainty. Courts clarifying statutory authority, policymakers providing direction, and markets determining how much durability they require before committing capital decisively. The trajectory remains open. The question is not simply whether emissions rules tighten or loosen. It is whether the legal foundation beneath them becomes settled again, or remains an evolving question. If you want to follow how that legal uncertainty intersects with markets, trade alignment, and long-term growth through 2026 and beyond, consider subscribing and joining the discussion. Because in complex systems, the most important changes rarely arrive loudly. They accumulate quietly and only become obvious in hindsight.